What do children falling on playgrounds and the pursuit of a just society have in common? So let's take the question of playgrounds first. I want you to imagine that you're on a playground and people are on the swings and coming down the slides and playing on the monkey bars, and one of the kids comes off the swing and goes crashing into the mulch. Now, there's a moment where their caretaker gets to respond to this situation. And often the first response, the intuitive response, is something like, "Are you okay?" and rushing over out of sudden concern. But if you hang out on playgrounds, you will notice that there are other possible responses. Certainly, you could do nothing, not respond to the child's injury. Or, as I sometimes see, caretakers will feign shock, even what they, or surprise, or even with a touch of delight instead of the concern that they actually feel. So instead of the reaction is something like, "Oh my gosh, what a big fall," with kind of like a rising tone question. And if you see this strategy deployed, there's a reason people use it. It's because sometimes kids take the emotional cues from their caretaker, and if you seem like the kid should be hurt, then the kid cries because they think they're hurt. Whereas if it just seems like a big fall and is kind of surprising, then the kid sometimes stands up and doesn't cry and goes away. Now, okay, what does this have to do with activism or the pursuit of justice? So, when you want something like justice in society, you often have criteria. I want things to be free and fair. I want there to be liberty or human flourishing. And when I look out at the world, it's pretty obvious that we're not doing so hot in all of these things. There's inequity and undignified death and all kinds of erosions of people agency and choices. And so one of the first responses when you see that is outrage, right? Anger. And expressing anger is often the most appropriate response that you can have. But if you hang out with people who have been doing activism for a long time, they're not universally angry. In fact, they have a diverse array of emotions and communicative patterns that they use to accomplish their activist goals. So sometimes they give people hope, or sometimes they evoke courage. Sometimes they marvel at the beauty of the community that they've come into contact with. And the thing that is common with this activist and the caretaker in the playground is that both of them are drawing from a thing called the communicative imaginary. Okay, so what is that? I define the communicative imaginary as a panoply or a diverse array of social possibilities. So when you're in a social situation, the paths that you see ahead, the different things that you think are possible, that is your communicative imaginary in that moment. And the choices that you end up making are always informed by what you thought was socially possible in that time. So sometimes we might find ourselves in an argument where we don't even want to be having the argument, but we don't know what to say to end the argument. In that moment, your communicative imaginary is very small. It's maybe empty. Whereas there are other times where we see all of these different possibilities, and because of that, we have all kinds of choices about which direction to go. And of course, having more choices gives us the ability to be more strategic and ultimately feel more free. But I want to be a little bit more specific with respect to this concept of what is the communicative imaginary. So I've defined it as an array of social possibilities, but I want to talk about some domains that exist inside the imaginary. So in my own activist work, one of the things that I have come to notice is that things are not simply broken. Yes, there are things that are tragic, and there are people who are suffering, and there's an extraordinary amount of pain in the world. And of course, to be insensible to that pain is kind of a dark way to live your life. But to never be able to see beyond any of that pain is also problematic. So I was once doing interviews with folks who were living in permanent supportive housing program in Los Angeles, and I had a good long drive between downtown LA and where I was living at the time. And I would take voice memos while I was driving back from the interviews, and then of course the interviews would be transcribed and I analyzed them. But one of the most important analytic activities that went on was me just grappling with what I had heard in the interviews, and sitting in the car for an hour and a half for a good long time, like, gave me a chance to do that. And so after the first set of interviews, Kristen asked me how was it, and I'm like, man, these interviews are tragic. And it was really the tragedy of it that stood out to me. But the second time I went and did the interviews, Kristen said, how were they? And I said, they were tragic, but these stories are also super courageous. Like, really, like, I had come to see the bravery that existed in all of the challenging stories that I had heard. And on the third time, when I came home, what I said was, "Gosh, these stories they're tragic. They are heroic, but they're also beautiful." As I had come to just be in awe of the raw humanity. And on the last time, the kind of framework that I had was heroic and tragic and beautiful and hilarious, because I had become comfortable enough to laugh with the people in their reflections and the ironies and dark humors, and the just regular old funny parts of their lives. This was the first time in my own work that I had realized that there is or must be a diverse array of communicative interpretations and therefore possible reactions to any issue of justice or injustice. So let me give you a for instance. Imagine that you go on outreach with a group of people, and you find some folks who are out on the streets, and you feed them, and the person that you're doing outreach with, their reaction is, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that we came out here and helped those people. They're suffering so bad. Like, it's so good that we were able to help them in their need." Okay, so, like, that's a fine emotion. There's nothing actually wrong with a courageous response to the tragedy of another person. But imagine that that person's perspective on that situation never, ever changes. And that the only thing that they ever encounter when they encounter somebody living without a home is someone who is suffering. Now, it's true, every day of being homeless, there's some kind of suffering. I mean, honestly, every day of everybody's life, there's some kind of suffering. So it's never wrong to recognize the suffering that is rooted in injustice. But I would argue that it's an undignified way of seeing another person. And I think that most people have an intuitive sense of this. Like, if you get treated like a broken bird all of the time, you end up feeling kind of infantilized, like a person is not taking you seriously. It's an erosion of your agency. If somebody never sees the ways that you're also thriving and succeeding, perhaps even against all odds, if I only see you as the sufferer, then yeah, I see a flattened version of you. And I think that this carries through all kinds of caring professions. Certainly, nurses and doctors can't only respond to their patients as broken people. Like, they also have to see you or us in the fullness of our humanity. Because what it boils down to is that the interpretive frame, like, is this a tragic situation? Is this a heroic situation? Is this a humorous situation? Is this a beautiful situation? Cues itself up to a set of activities. So I respond to suffering a particular way. And obviously, laughter or joy is different than something like a courageous response in the face of fear. So these domains, the humorous, the joyful, the painful and suffering, the heroic and courageous, or the beautiful and awe-inspiring aspects of justice in society, become part of our communicative imaginary. And so, as we imagine, how do I respond to the food insecurity of a friend of mine who recently lost their job? It's helpful to be able to think, how can I see the pain and hunger that that food insecurity is going to cause, but at the same time be able to laugh with them about ironic or humorous aspects of their situation, or to recognize the courage that they are demonstrating by not asking for help, or to appreciate the beautiful ways that they have, pivoted their life to make do or to make ends meet. And that if I'm only caught in the suffering of their food insecurity, I flatten their humanity, and I cannot react to them in a way that is fully rich or fully, responsive to the person that they are. So I want to kind of close by saying that this is not only about how we as people show up for other folks in the pursuit of justice. Certainly being able to say, well, the heroic frame is courageously struggling against triumph, and if you fail, right, the heroic frame is less less satisfying. But sometimes you have to laugh at all of the impossible odds that were in front of you, and there's great resolve that you get by shifting between these frames. But it also contributes to our well-beings when we survive suffering and inequity. And so, not to put too fine a point on it, when I think about what is happening in the world right now, and I see the suffering of so many people, hundreds of thousands of people contracting an illness that they have very little ability to respond to. If my own interpretive world only has space for suffering, it's very easy to become profoundly overwhelmed at how little there is to do to respond. And even though by seeing suffering, it makes me able to respond with compassion to people who themselves are suffering, there's also a point where I've consumed so much trauma, either of my own or people around me, or vicariously through news media, that my ability to respond compassionately is also eroded. And so there becomes a great thinking about the communicative imaginary, and asking what is the array of social possibilities for how I interpret the situation in front of me, and being able to kind of run through this list. What is the courage that I see demonstrated in this moment? Where are the heroes, and what are they doing? And what is the suffering, of course, that's happening here? But also, what are the beautiful acts of humanity that are being demonstrated, and what here renders me to fall on my knees in awe of the situation? And lastly, what is funny? Maybe it's a dark humor in the face of suffering, or maybe it's just honest to goodness irony, or just some hilarious timing of how things work. And I find that my own inner life is deeply affected if I become locked in one of these regions of the communicative imaginary, if my only interpretive frame is one of courage or suffering or any of them. And it's not a prescription. It's not like, oh, like first you do this and then you do this and then you do this. I think of the communicative imaginary more like this like big messy kitchen, because it only has the things that we put into it, the things that we imagine. They only get there if we see them or we make them. So the communicative imaginary is populated by, or the ingredients or building materials in the imaginary are the ones that we put there culturally, socially, or individually. But then that also becomes a place that we can pull out from the different possibilities, and make choices about how we show up for others and how we make sense ourselves. So this is the common thread between the pursuit of justice and children falling on playgrounds. That how we respond is rooted in drawing out of this kind of imaginative social world, what options are in front of me? And if I don't like the options that are, what are some new ones maybe that I and the people around me could craft and then do?